Big topic today, guys. I've got a theory why I think that vintage sports cards are going to continue to drop here over time. I've got two big main points, and then I've got an interesting story at the end that I saw on another YouTube channel that I want to share with you. Stick around. What's going on, sports card family? Hope everyone in the U.S. having an amazing Thanksgiving week and a good holiday season so far. Today we're going to talk about vintage cards, vintage sports cards. And I've just had some things on my mind lately I wanted to share here in this video. Before I get started, huge thanks to today's video sponsor, COMC.com, your home for buying, selling, and flipping all the hottest trading cards. Their consignment marketplace now home to over 33 million cards from baseball's biggest stars like Shohei Ohtani, Aaron Judge, and Mookie Betts to Marvel favorites like Spider-Man, Thor, and Captain America. COMC has something for every type of collector, so make sure to visit my COMC links down in the video description as well as in the pinned comments below. Reason number one why I think there's going to be some amazing deals on vintage sports cards in the coming years, and let me differentiate here a little bit, some nuance here. I'm not necessarily talking about 8s, 9s, and 10 grades. I'm more talking about lower to mid-end type stuff. And the reason number one, the huge increase of graded supply. I don't know if we all realize exactly how many new vintage graded cards are hitting the market every single month. If I'm looking at gem rate data that shows here in October 2023, Frank, let's get some pictures up here, some visuals, visual aids. The big four grading companies, SGC, PSA, CGC, and Beckett, grading about 1.5 million cards every single month, 1,500,000 cards approximately, and that's just the big four. There's other grading companies as well that people use. But the thing that kind of struck me here was, yes, I mean, you do have a lot of modern cards are being graded, mostly modern cards, but if I'm looking at the breakdown here of what's going on, and let's just use PSA, they're grading the most volume of anybody else. They are from 70s, 60s, 50s, and prior in October. About 10% of their sports cards were in that bucket. So that's firmly in the vintage camp there. 70s, 60s, 50s, and then going back pre-war and all that. So out of 1.2 million cards, you break that down into the sports cards, about 600,000 sports cards. About 10% of those were vintage cards, 60,000 cards. And then when you look across the other three grading companies, you add up, do the numbers, about 100,000 vintage cards hit the market in October alone. Well, it didn't necessarily hit the market. Okay, we'll back up a little bit. But we're graded. We're graded in October alone. So think about that when we look at vintage pop reports. You know, a lot of the stuff, it looks pretty low. But we already know that these cards are not rare. Sure, if you go back to, Tito 06 and those sorts of things, I'm sure there's a lot of obscure and rare cards in the mix there. So I understand there's nuance to the discussion. But this shows you that almost 100,000 new, freshly graded vintage cards hit the market in just October of 2023 alone. And so for all of us that are trying to figure out the supply side, it's always a wonder as to how much more of that is going to be found. We always hear about new collections being found every day.
When this woman bought a fixer-upper house, she had no idea what was behind one of the bedroom walls.
You look at the people that are going around the American picker style, chasing cardboard. You know, they're out there, they're buying collections, they're looking at collections. And what typically do we see? We see, oh, well, they had a lot of, 80s, 90s, junk wax era type stuff. But then we found these vintage gems. And then what happens then? Sure, they might be graded, some of them, and they might consign for them, or they might buy them at a discount, sell, resell as a business would. Or they find them ungraded, and what are they looking at? Of course, they're going to grade those cards, and they're going to resell. And that is the churn, which is kind of interesting, because I know when we think of flippers, we typically think of Roth cards. Kenny are out here flipping modern-day quarterbacks, and, there's, of course, the big risk, reward, whatever. But really, where there's a lot of buy and sell, buy raw, grade, and sell, it's in the vintage space. There's a lot of people out here that are searching around for vintage collections. They're finding them, they're buying them raw, and they're grading them, because even if a vintage card grades out at 2, it's still, you're adding value to it typically. Whereas With a modern card, a lot of times you grade it out. If you don't get a 10, if you get a 9, we've seen plenty. How many different PSA subs or grading subs have you seen come back where it's like, I graded 20 cards, 4 of them were 10s, and the rest were 8s and 9s, but the 4 10s made it worthwhile for me. Well, with vintage cards, you're less worried about that. It's like, well, if it's a 2, we break even. If it's a 5, we do really well or whatever. And if we get a 7, then we hit it out of the park. And so, of course, what happens as we get more and more and more of the graded supply that's hitting the market? Downward pressure on prices. Grading has never been more popular, and it doesn't look to be slowing down at all. It just doesn't. When you look at the numbers, PSA, SGC, these companies have been solidly grading for going on 18 months, a couple years. Going back to when the companies were overloaded, it slowed everything down. You had a lot of wait times and so forth with the grading companies. But now they're really churning. These guys are really up to speed and they're really ready to roll. A lot of the grading companies have adapted, and a lot of people love the buying raw to grade. And that's a whole hobby in itself, I feel like, is that grading process of what are my grades going to be, and trying to strategize as to, what returns could be buying and selling that way. But also for collectors that have a cool card, it's like, man, will it be an 8? Will it be a 10? Will it be a 3? There's kind of a thrill to the unknown that grading offers, and there's a fun element to it. So grading is at all-time highs. That we have never been at a point in card history where more cards are being graded. If we start seeing in the news that there's plastic shortages, we can't get any more Tupperware out here, it's probably because the grading companies are taking all the plastics. And so this really makes the low to mid-end graded stuff vulnerable price-wise. Because again, more supply, if that demand isn't there to meet it, then it's going to continue to drop prices. And it seems inevitable that there will be more supply of cards, especially key cards. In modern, of course, there's certain cards, Prism Silver, Prism Gold, or an RPA. With vintage, it's more about player. It's a Roberto Clemente card, it's a Mantle card, it's a Mays card. Everyone's looking for these cards. It's like everyone's out here searching for in attics, in basements, grave diggers out here trying to find all these vintage cards, and they're finding them to grade them. They want to grade them. So that's a vulnerability. And it also just tells me I've got time on these cards, man. One card I really want is a 55 Bowman Willie Mays. I love the TV, kind of that wood border. I feel like you love it or you hate it. Some vintage collectors can't stand that card. I really enjoy the card. But I've been looking at them, prices went up, of course, over the last few years. And I'm just like, what is the big rush for me to get this card? And there might be double, triple the graded supply in 2, 3, 5 years. I'd rather just wait. It's not something I need to own today. And vintage cards have been hot. It's been kind of a movement into, oh crap, modern cards not holding value. Where can I be safe, so to speak, in quotations? Vintage, move to vintage. But I think that what we're going to find is that there's going to be a lot of supply of this vintage, which leads me into my second reason, or my second point of the hypothesis. The typical vintage collector is on the older side. The boomers, the baby boomers. I would say when I'm at a card show and I look at who is buying vintage cards, sure, there's definitely guys like me that 30s, 40s, but there's a lot of 50s, 60s, 70s that own vintage collections. And I remember talking to a dealer at the Philly show, how the heck do you always have great vintage stuff? And he just said, hey, look, the people pass away, they end up retiring, and they just get, it's like all this stuff laying around. They need money for retirement. They might need, money for the nursing home or whatever it is. And you've got these things that are sitting around that, of course, you enjoy, but also have increased in value quite a bit over the last few years. And so you always have people selling off collections at the same time. And so we have this big baby boomer generation that has got a lot of amazing vintage collections that eventually are going to come back down into the ecosystem. The deepest collector base in the entire hobby is vintage baseball, hands down. Nobody can really argue that. Baseball card collectors are where it all started. You've got a deep history that ties in with baseball cards. And so there is a great love for collecting baseball cards. But of course, just like for me, look, if I pass away tomorrow, yes, there's going to be certain things that my family pulls out to hang on to. Oh, dad really enjoyed this, we'll hang on to this. But probably 75, 80%, maybe 90% of it is headed to auction, in some fashion. That's just the reality of it. And so when I think about all of the vintage baseball card collectors, and there's lots of them, whether they be my age, kind of early 40s, moving up into the, into the 80s with the Fogels, the Marshall Fogels of the world, eventually a lot of this stuff is going to move back down, and will that next generation be ready for it? I actually do think there's a lot of people in their 30s and 40s like me that talking probably the same way that I am. I would love to get into some nice vintage stuff, but at the price points, I'm not currently willing to do so. And so the added supply kind of moving into the market, back into the market eventually, whether it be graded supply and more collections coming to market, eventually I think it does kind of push these cards down to that next generation, making them more affordable. But I'm going to go back to the first point again. I think we're in a big grading boom time. I know that people think, oh, the pandemic, there's all these cards and all this interest during the pandemic. But the last 2 years, really, as card prices have been moving downward, has been a huge grading boom that we have never seen before in this market. And if it continues on through the 2020s, let's get to 2030 and see where we're at. What is that going to look like? What is that supply going to look like compared to what we have today? And what does that mean for price points on a lot of fairly common baseball cards? And so what I'm watching on that gem rate data is, when does the grading slow down for vintage? Meaning, like, let's take a look each month and see, okay, they graded about 60, 70, 80, 90,000 cards. When it starts reaching a point where there's just not that many vintage cards getting graded by all these companies, then it's like, okay, maybe we're finally getting to the end of the ungraded supply of these cards. Maybe we're finally reaching the point where it's like, all right, they're not finding as many new collections. We are hitting a point where we're really finding out what has truly survived and what's still out there. Because for a lot of collectibles right now, we don't know the answers. And the only way we can have some sort of semblance as to what those numbers are is through grading companies. So I know it sounds kind of, there's a lot of people who are like, I hate grading, I don't want to grade. But it does give us some sort of idea of supply out there. Whereas without it, we're just flying blind. If you just have everything is ungraded out there, it's hard to tell the difference between one or the other. Each one has a certain number, and so forth. It makes it a little bit easier over time to track. And so that's where, when I look at not just vintage cards, but a lot of collectibles in general, but I want to touch on vintage today because it is seen as safe. It is seen as, the place to put money, and it slowly goes up over time. But the thing I think people are not taking into account are these couple of factors here. And so I wanted to share the last piece that I wanted to share with you. This is an interesting story that I saw. Brian, Cajun Cardboard channel, YouTube channel, he was doing a Thanksgiving live stream, and he was talking about basketball cards, but he went off on a little bit of a tangent where he was talking about, he bought a collection with a lot of 86 Fleer, and he was looking to sell 86 Fleer Commons. He's like, I just don't need these. What do I do with these? And somebody had reached out to him. He had 300 or 400 86 Fleer Commons that he wanted to get rid of. And the guy wanted to buy all of them. And he said, just out of curiosity, what are you doing with these? I think he paid $4 per common or something like that. Paid good money to get a few hundred Commons, 86 Fleer, which generally, they're out there. We'll take the story with a grain of salt until we actually see the final product. 'Cause this was something that Brian just heard, but we haven't seen one yet. And so this is what's interesting. So the guy is buying game used jerseys. He's got the 86 Fleer Common. He's getting them signed. He's getting them autographed like what you would, like as we've seen the rise in vintage aftermarket signatures, okay? Getting it slabbed up. And Beckett is doing something with a slab to where they're authenticating the game used patch. They're not adding the patch to the card. So this is something that is like a card signed, and then you've got a game used patch in a Beckett slab. And this might be some sort of a top secret thing that just kind of like accidentally was let out into the universe. But that made me think, and it's just like, man, haven't we seen how, vintage cards that are not rare, people are trying to add scarcity, add rarity to vintage cards by almost creating their own sort of like RPA type or, RPA or, patch auto, because they weren't making those, of course, back then. There's no such thing as a patch autographed vintage card from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. There's just nothing that the companies weren't making them. They were just making cardboard cards. And so this is almost adding sports memorabilia to a card, but not actually like adding it into the card. It's a side piece that goes with the card in the slab, being sold as a collectible eventually. And again, kind of rumor mill a little bit, because we haven't seen the end product. This is something that just came through the grapevine. But I thought that was really interesting as people continue to try to add specialness. I'm going to make up a word here. I don't think, is that a word? Someone help me in the comments. Specialness. Adding specialness to otherwise basic cards. Otherwise basic vintage cards that might have been printed to the moon. But I thought that was really kind of cool and interesting. And will that be something that catches on over time where people are buying these things? And will companies authenticate these? This is something, the rumor is it's Beckett. Haven't seen one, so don't know. We'll see. But what if that's something that starts to catch on where companies are open to these sorts of ideas? We'll have to see how that turns out because, again, authentication, tricky business. It's hard. We've seen this over and over again. Grading companies do their best, but it's tough. So we will see how it pans out. That's all I've got today, guys. I know there's a lot to unpack here, but was thinking about this on my drive home today and wanted to share. Stay healthy, stay awesome, and I will talk to you again later.